The dust kicked up in lazy spirals as the stagecoach rolled to a stop outside Millbrook Station, wheels creaking like old bones settling into rest. It was the kind of afternoon where the sun hung heavy and merciless, painting everything the color of dried blood and forgotten dreams. The driver climbed down slow, his face weathered like old leather, spitting tobacco juice into the dirt before wiping his mouth with the back of his sleeve. Inside the coach, pressed against the worn velvet seats, sat a woman whose hands trembled despite her best efforts to still them. Her dress was simple gray cotton, travel-stained and dusty, but clean. Her hair was pinned back severe and proper, though loose strands had escaped during the long journey from Missouri. She clutched a small leather satchel in her lap like it contained everything she owned, which it nearly did. Her name was Clara Whitmore, and she was about to meet her husband for the first time. The arrangement had been made through letters, careful words exchanged between strangers across 1,000 miles of prairie and promise. She had answered his advertisement in the Kansas City paper, a simple notice that read, "Rancher seeks wife. Honest work, honest home. Write to Thomas Brennan, Millbrook Station, Colorado Territory." The correspondence that followed had been polite, formal, filled with the kind of cautious hope that people carried when they had little left to lose. Clara stepped down from the coach, her boots touching Colorado soil for the first time. The air was thinner here, sharp with the scent of sage and distant snow from the mountains that rose like ancient guardians on the horizon. She looked around the small station, searching for the face that matched the description from his letters. Tall, brown hair, kind eyes, a scar on his left hand from a branding iron accident 3 summers past. But the platform was empty except for the driver unloading mail bags and a few crates of supplies. No one waited for her. No one came forward with recognition in their eyes or her name on their lips. The driver glanced at her, then at the small crowd that had gathered to watch the weekly stage arrival. "You being met, miss?" Clara nodded, though uncertainty crept into her voice. "Yes, I believe so, Mr. Thomas Brennan." "Do you know him?" The driver's expression changed, grew careful. He looked at the station master, an older man with wire spectacles who had been sorting through the mail. The two exchanged a glance that spoke of knowledge Clara did not possess. "Well," the driver said slowly, "I reckon you best speak to Mr. Henderson there. He runs the station." Henderson approached, removing his spectacles and cleaning them with deliberate care. His movements were those of a man preparing to deliver news that would sit heavy on his conscience. "Miss Whitmore, I presume." "Yes, that's right. I'm here to meet Mr. Brennan. Has he been delayed?" Henderson's jaw worked silently for a moment. Behind him, the small crowd had grown quiet, their conversations dying to whispers. "Miss, I'm afraid I have some difficult news. Thomas Brennan passed away 2 weeks ago. Fever took him sudden-like." "We sent word, but I suppose it didn't reach you in time." The words hit Clara like a physical blow. She swayed slightly, her grip tightening on the satchel. The ground beneath her feet seemed to shift, as if the very earth had become unreliable. "Passed away." "Yes, miss, I'm truly sorry. It was quick, if that's any comfort. Doc said he didn't suffer much." Clara stared at him, trying to process the information. 2 weeks ago. While she had been making final preparations, selling her few belongings, saying goodbye to the only life she had known, the man who was to be her husband had been dying. The letters she had written, the careful plans they had made, the future she had dared to imagine, all of it had been built on ground that was already giving way. "I see," she said quietly, though she did not see it all. Nothing made sense anymore. Henderson shifted uncomfortably. "Miss, do you have family back east, somewhere you can return to?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Clara looked around the station, at the faces watching her with varying degrees of curiosity and pity. Return to what? She had spent her last dollar on the train ticket west. Her small inheritance from her father had been carefully budgeted for this journey and the start of a new life. There was nothing left behind her but closed doors and empty rooms. "No," she said, her voice barely audible. "No family." The silence that followed was thick with the weight of unspoken possibilities. Clara was stranded, alone, with no means of returning east and no reason to stay west. She was a woman without a place in a world that demanded women have places. From the back of the small crowd, a voice spoke up. She could work at the boarding house. Mrs. Patterson's been looking for help. Henderson nodded slowly. "That's true. It's honest work, and she'd have a place to stay." Clara looked toward the voice and saw a woman in her 40s, sturdy and practical, with kind eyes and flour-dusted hands. "I'm Sarah Patterson. I run the boarding house just down the street. It's not much, but it's clean and safe. You'd help with cooking and cleaning, and I'd provide room and board plus a small wage." It was not the life Clara had imagined, but it was a life. She nodded, not trusting her voice to remain steady. "Thank you, I would be grateful for the work." As the small crowd began to disperse, Clara felt the weight of her new reality settling around her like a heavy coat. She had traveled 1,000 miles to marry a dead man, and now she was a servant in a frontier town where she knew no one and had no one. The future she had carefully planned had dissolved like morning mist, leaving her standing in the dust with nothing but the clothes on her back and the stubborn determination that had brought her this far. Mrs. Patterson approached, her expression gentle but businesslike. "Come along then, dear, let's get you settled. Tomorrow's soon enough to start working, but today you need rest and a proper meal." Clara followed her new employer down the dusty main street of Millbrook Station, past the general store and the saloon, past the church with its simple wooden cross and the blacksmith shop where the ring of hammer on anvil provided a steady rhythm to the afternoon. She tried not to think about the letters in her satchel, the careful words Thomas Brennan had written about his ranch, about the life they would build together, about the children they might have and the dreams they would share. The boarding house was a 2-story frame building with a wide porch and clean windows. Mrs. Patterson led her inside, through a parlor furnished with simple but comfortable furniture, and up a narrow staircase to a small room under the eaves. It contained a bed, a washstand, and a single window that looked out over the street. "It's not much," Mrs. Patterson said, "but it's yours. Meals are at 6, noon and 6. Church on Sundays if you're inclined." "Any questions?" Clara shook her head, setting her satchel on the bed. "No, ma'am, thank you for your kindness." Mrs. Patterson studied her for a moment, taking in the careful composure that barely held back the grief and uncertainty. "You're not the first woman to come west chasing a dream that turned to dust, but you're strong, I can see that, and strength counts for a lot out here." After Mrs. Patterson left, Clara sat on the edge of the bed and finally allowed herself to feel the full weight of her situation. She was alone in a way she had never been before, cut loose from everything familiar and safe. The life she had planned was gone, replaced by uncertainty and the daily struggle of survival. But as she sat there in the gathering dusk, listening to the sounds of the frontier town settling into evening, Clara felt something unexpected stirring within her. It was not hope exactly, but something harder and more enduring. It was the recognition that she had survived this far, that she had found a way forward when there seemed to be none. And if she could do that, perhaps she could do more. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, a sound both lonely and wild. Clara rose from the bed and went to the window, looking out at the street where lanterns were beginning to flicker to life in windows up and down the block. This was not the life she had planned, but it was the life she had been given. And Clara Whitmore, mail-order bride to a dead man, servant in a frontier boarding house, was determined to make something of it. The days that followed blurred together like watercolors in the rain, each one bleeding into the next with the rhythm of endless chores and small kindnesses. Clara rose before dawn, her hands learning the weight of cast iron pans and the particular way flour had to be sifted just so to make Mrs. Patterson's famous biscuits. She swept floors worn smooth by countless boots, changed bed linens that smelled of tobacco and whiskey and the particular loneliness that clung to traveling men, and served meals to boarders who nodded politely but rarely spoke her name. The work was honest but hard, the kind that left her fingers cracked and her back aching by evening. Yet there was something almost comforting in the routine, in the way each task had its place and purpose. She had structure again, even if it was not the structure she had dreamed of during those long nights in Missouri, reading Thomas Brennan's letters by lamplight and imagining the life they would build together. Mrs. Patterson proved to be a fair employer, stern but not unkind, with the sort of practical wisdom that came from years of managing both a business and the rough men who frequented it. She taught Clara which boarders to avoid after they'd been drinking, how to make coffee strong enough to wake the dead, and the delicate art of mending torn clothing with stitches so small they were nearly invisible. "A woman alone has to be twice as careful and 3 times as clever," she told Clara one evening as they worked together in the kitchen, preparing tomorrow's bread. Men will test you, see what you're made of. Show weakness once and they'll remember it forever. Show strength and they'll respect you for it. Clara absorbed these lessons like dry earth absorbing rain. She learned to keep her voice steady when dealing with difficult customers, to meet their eyes without flinching, to carry herself with the quiet dignity that demanded respect even from those who might not be inclined to give it freely. It was during her third week in Millbrook Station that she first noticed him. He came into the boarding house just after noon, hat in hand, boots dusty from the trail. He was tall and lean, with the kind of weathered face that spoke of long days under the sun and longer nights under the stars. His clothes were clean but worn, patched in places with careful stitches that suggested a man who knew the value of making things last. What struck Clara most was the way he moved, with a quiet economy of motion that wasted nothing, like a man who had learned that every gesture counted. He approached the front desk where Clara was working on the ledger, updating the accounts with Mrs. Patterson's careful script. When he spoke, his voice was low and steady, with the particular cadence of someone who chose his words carefully. "Ma'am, I'm looking for work," heard Mrs. Patterson might need help with repairs around the place. Clara looked up from the ledger, meeting his eyes. They were gray, like storm clouds gathering on the horizon, and there was something in them that spoke of depths she could not fathom. "I'll get Mrs. Patterson for you, Mr. Colt, Jessie Colt." She found Mrs. Patterson in the pantry, counting supplies with the methodical precision of someone who had learned that waste could mean the difference between profit and ruin. "There's a man here about work, says he heard you might need help with repairs." Mrs. Patterson's eyebrows rose slightly. "What's his name?" "Jessie Colt." Something shifted in Mrs. Patterson's expression, a flicker of recognition followed by careful consideration. "I see. Well, send him back here. I'll speak with him." Clara returned to find Jessie Colt examining the front door, running his fingers along the frame where the wood had begun to warp. He looked up when she approached, and she found herself momentarily caught by the directness of his gaze. "Mrs. Patterson will see you now," through the kitchen, past the pantry. He nodded, replacing his hat with the same careful precision with which he had removed it. "Thank you, ma'am." As he walked away, Clara found herself watching the way he moved, the quiet confidence in his stride. There was something about him that seemed both familiar and foreign, like a half-remembered song or a face glimpsed in a crowd. She shook her head, returning to the ledger, but her concentration was broken, the neat columns of figures swimming before her eyes. 20 minutes later, Jessie Colt emerged from the back of the house, Mrs. Patterson beside him. They shook hands like people who had reached an understanding, and Clara heard Mrs. Patterson say, "You can start tomorrow, 7 sharp." After he left, Mrs. Patterson returned to the front desk, her expression thoughtful. Clara looked up from the ledger, curiosity winning over discretion. "Did you hire him?" "I did. Place needs fixing up and he seems capable enough." Mrs. Patterson paused, studying Clara's face. "You know anything about him?" "No, ma'am, should I?" Mrs. Patterson was quiet for a moment, then shrugged. "Probably not, but in a town this size, everyone knows everyone else's business. Jessie Colt's been gone for nigh on 2 years. Folks wondered if he'd ever come back." Clara wanted to ask more, but something in Mrs. Patterson's tone suggested the subject was closed. She returned to her work, but throughout the afternoon, she found herself glancing toward the front door, half expecting to see the tall figure with the storm-gray eyes. The next morning, Clara was in the kitchen preparing breakfast when she heard the sound of hammering from the front porch. Through the window, she could see Jessie Colt working on the steps, his movements economical and sure. He had removed his jacket, and she could see the play of muscle beneath his shirt as he worked, the way his hands moved with the confidence of someone who had spent years learning the language of wood and nail and grain. She told herself she was not watching him, that she was simply aware of his presence the way one might be aware of weather or the passage of time. But when he paused to wipe sweat from his brow, when he stepped back to examine his work with the critical eye of a craftsman, she found her own work slowing, her attention drawn to the rhythm of his labor. During the noon meal, he came into the dining room with the other boarders, taking a seat at the long table where the men gathered to eat and share the day's news. Clara served the meal as she always did, moving quietly between the kitchen and the dining room, refilling coffee cups and clearing plates. But she found herself acutely aware of his presence, of the way he ate with the same careful economy that marked all his movements, of the way he listened to the conversation around him without adding much to it. It was during dessert that the conversation turned to the topic that had been dancing at the edges of polite discourse since Clara's arrival. "Shame about young Brennan," said one of the boarders, a traveling salesman named Mitchell who had been staying at the boarding house for the better part of a week. "Heard he was all set to marry some girl from back east." Clara's hands stilled on the coffee pot she was holding. The dining room grew quiet, the kind of silence that suggested everyone knew exactly who that girl had been. "Poor thing," Mitchell continued, either oblivious to the tension or choosing to ignore it. "Can't imagine what it must be like, coming all that way to find your intended dead and buried." "Mitchell, Mrs." Patterson's voice cut through the silence like a blade. "Perhaps we could discuss something else." But Mitchell was the sort of man who mistook awkwardness for entertainment. "I'm just saying it's a tragedy, young woman like that, alone in the world. Makes a man wonder what'll become of her." Clara felt the weight of every eye in the room, the careful sympathy mixed with curiosity that had followed her since her arrival. She kept her face composed, her movements steady, but inside she felt the familiar burning of shame and grief that came with being the subject of other people's pity. It was then that Jesse Colt spoke, his voice quiet but carrying easily through the silence. "Seems to me that's her business, not ours." The rebuke was gentle but unmistakable. Mitchell's face reddened, but he had the sense to let the subject drop. The conversation turned to other things, safer things, and Clara continued her work with hands that trembled only slightly. Later, as she was clearing the last of the dishes, she found herself alone in the dining room with Jesse Colt. He was finishing his coffee, his gray eyes distant, lost in thoughts she could not read. "Thank you," she said quietly, not looking at him as she stacked the plates. He looked up, and she could feel the weight of his attention like sunlight on her face. "For what?" "For what you said. About it being my business." He was quiet for a long moment, then nodded. "A person's grief is their own to carry, no one else's to pick apart." There was something in his voice, a weight that suggested he spoke from experience. Clara looked up, meeting his eyes, and for a moment she saw something there that matched what she carried in her own heart. Recognition, perhaps, the particular understanding that came from loss. "Yes," she said simply. "It is." They looked at each other across the empty dining room, two people who had learned that life rarely unfolded according to plan, that sometimes the best you could do was find your footing on uncertain ground and keep moving forward. Then Jesse Colt rose from his chair, placed his hat on his head, and walked out into the afternoon sun, leaving Clara alone with the dishes and the strange sense that something had shifted, however slightly, in the careful balance of her new life. That evening, Clara found herself lingering by the kitchen window longer than necessary, watching Jesse Colt work in the fading light. He had moved from the front porch to the side of the building, where a section of siding had warped and pulled away from the frame. His movements were methodical, patient, the kind of work that could not be rushed without ruining the whole effort. Mrs. Patterson appeared beside her, wiping her hands on her apron. "He's got good hands for the work," she observed, her tone carefully neutral. Clara nodded, not trusting herself to speak. There was something about the way he worked that reminded her of her father, back when she was a child and the world still made sense. The same quiet concentration, the same respect for the tools and materials, the same understanding that good work was its own reward. "Known him long?" Clara asked, trying to keep the question casual. "Mrs." Patterson was quiet for a moment, her eyes on the figure working in the gathering dusk. "Since he was a boy. His family had a spread about 10 miles north of here before the drought hit. Lost everything in the dry years, then lost more when the bank came calling." She paused as if deciding how much to reveal. "His father took it hard, took to drinking, then took to his fists. Jesse left when he was barely 17, said he was going to make his fortune and come back to buy the place back." Mrs. Patterson's voice carried the weight of old sadness. "That was near 8 years ago. He came back once, about 2 years past, but whatever he found here sent him riding out again within a week." Clara absorbed this information, filing it away with the growing collection of observations she had made about Jesse Colt. The careful way he handled tools as if they were precious, the way he ate like someone who had known hunger, the way he listened to conversations without joining them as if he was still learning how to be part of the world again. "And now he's back," Clara said. Now he's back, Mrs. Patterson agreed. Question is, for how long this time? The next morning brought rain, a steady downpour that turned the streets to mud and sent boarders scurrying for cover. Clara stood at the front window, watching the water cascade from the eaves, when she noticed Jesse Colt on the porch. He was not working, could not work in this weather, but he had not taken shelter inside either. He stood at the far end of the porch, leaning against one of the posts, his hat tilted down against the rain that the wind occasionally drove under the overhang. Without quite deciding to do it, Clara found herself walking to the front door. She opened it and stepped out onto the porch, the sound of rain on the roof suddenly loud in her ears. Mr. Colt. He turned, and she saw that his eyes held the same distant quality she had noticed before, as if he was seeing something beyond the present moment. Ma'am, I thought you might like some coffee. It's a cold morning. He studied her face for a moment, as if trying to read some hidden meaning in her words. Then he nodded. That's kind of you. She went back inside and returned with 2 cups, handing one to him. The coffee was strong and black, the way Mrs. Patterson had taught her to make it, and the warmth of the cup felt good against her palms. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the rain turn the world gray and soft. Clara found herself stealing glances at his profile, noting the way his jaw was set, the small scar that ran from his left ear to his collar, the way his hands wrapped around the coffee cup like he was trying to absorb its warmth. Beautiful country, she said finally, gesturing toward the mountains that rose beyond the town, their peaks lost in low clouds. It is, he agreed, unforgiving but beautiful. There was something in his tone that made her look at him more closely. You sound like you know it well. He was quiet for a long moment, then nodded. Grew up here, every rock and tree, every creek and canyon, used to think I'd never leave. But you did. But I did. He took a sip of coffee, his eyes distant. Sometimes leaving is the only choice you have left. Clara understood something about that, about the way circumstances could close around you like a fist, leaving only one way out. And sometimes coming back is the only choice you have left. He looked at her then, really looked at her, and she saw recognition in his eyes. Not of her face, but of something deeper, some shared understanding of what it meant to have your life stripped down to its essentials, to find yourself starting over with nothing but will and determination. Yes, he said quietly, sometimes it is. The rain continued to fall, drumming against the roof and running in rivers down the street. Clara found herself reluctant to go back inside, to return to the familiar routine of chores and careful politeness. Out here on the porch, with the rain creating a curtain between them and the rest of the world, she felt something she had not felt since leaving Missouri. She felt like herself again, not the mail-order bride who had failed to marry her intended, not the servant girl who cleaned rooms and served meals, but Clara Whitmore, a woman with her own thoughts and feelings, and the right to express them. I should get back to work, she said finally, though she made no move to leave. Should I? He agreed, glancing at his tools where they sat protected under a tarp. But neither of them moved, and Clara found herself thinking about the strange turns life could take, the way a person could set out for one destination and end up somewhere entirely different. She had come west to marry Thomas Brennan, to build a life with a man she had never met. Instead, she was standing on a boarding house porch, sharing coffee with a drifter whose eyes held secrets she could not begin to fathom. Mr. Colt, she said, the words coming out before she could stop them. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you had made different choices? He turned to look at her, and she saw something flicker in his expression, surprise perhaps, or recognition. Every day, he said simply. I came here to marry a man I had never met, she heard herself saying. Thomas Brennan. We had been writing letters for months, planning a life together. When I arrived, I found out he had died 2 weeks earlier. Jesse Colt's expression grew grave. I'm sorry for your loss. The strange thing is, Clara continued, I'm not sure it was a loss exactly. How can you lose something you never really had? I'm sad for him, for his death, but I'm not sure I'm grieving the life we might have had together. I'm grieving the idea of that life, the possibility of it. She paused, wondering why she was telling him this, why she felt compelled to share thoughts she had barely admitted to herself. I keep thinking about all the choices that led me here. If I had not answered his advertisement, if I had stayed in Missouri, if I had been braver or more foolish or more practical. Each choice led to another, and another until I ended up here, in this place I never planned to be. Jesse Colt was quiet for a long moment, his eyes on the rain-soaked street. When he spoke, his voice was thoughtful. My father used to say that life was like following a river. You can try to swim against the current, or you can let it carry you where it will. Either way, you end up downstream from where you started. And which do you think is better? He smiled then, a small, sad smile that transformed his entire face. I think maybe the trick is knowing when to fight and when to let go. Clara found herself smiling back, feeling something lighten in her chest. That sounds like wisdom. If it is, it's hard-earned. They finished their coffee in companionable silence, and when the rain finally began to ease, Clara collected the empty cups and prepared to go inside. As she reached the door, Jesse Colt spoke again. Miss Whitmore. She turned back to him, surprised by the use of her name. She had not realized he knew it. Thank you for the coffee and for, he paused as if searching for the right words. For understanding. Clara nodded, feeling heat rise in her cheeks. Thank you, Mr. Colt, for listening. As she went back inside, Clara found herself thinking about the conversation, about the way Jesse Colt had listened to her words without judgment, without the careful pity she had grown accustomed to seeing in other people's eyes. He had not tried to offer solutions or comfort, had not suggested that everything happened for a reason or that time would heal all wounds. He had simply listened, and in that listening, she had found something she had not expected to find again. She had found understanding. Over the following days, Clara found herself increasingly aware of Jesse Colt's presence, not in any dramatic way, but in the small moments that made up the rhythm of daily life. The sound of his hammer in the early morning, the way he nodded politely when their paths crossed, the careful attention he paid to his work. She began to notice things about him that she had not seen before, the way he always cleaned his tools before putting them away, the way he spoke gently to Mrs. Patterson's old dog, the way he sometimes paused in his work to look toward the mountains with an expression she could not quite read. She also began to notice the way other people in the town reacted to him. There was something in their manner, a careful distance that spoke of old history and unfinished business. The men at the general store nodded when he passed, but their conversations grew quieter. The women looked at him with a mixture of curiosity and caution, as if he was a puzzle they could not quite solve. It was during her weekly trip to the general store that Clara learned more about the source of this wariness. She was selecting vegetables for the week's meals when she overheard a conversation between two women near the fabric counter. Still can't believe he had the nerve to come back, one was saying, her voice pitched low but carrying clearly in the small space. After what happened with the Hendricks place, the other replied, shaking her head. Poor Sarah Hendricks, having to see his face around town again. Clara's hands stilled on the potatoes she was examining. Sarah Hendricks was the banker's daughter, a pretty woman about Clara's age who taught at the local school. Clara had seen her in church, had noticed the way men's eyes followed her when she walked down the street. It wasn't his fault what happened, the first woman said, though her tone suggested she was not entirely convinced. Judge cleared him of any wrongdoing. Being cleared by law and being cleared by conscience are two different things, the second woman replied. That boy died because of choices Jesse Colt made, cleared or not. Clara felt her stomach tighten. A boy had died. Whatever had driven Jesse Colt away from Millbrook Station 2 years ago, it had involved death and it had involved Sarah Hendricks. Still, the first woman continued, it's been 2 years. Maybe it's time to let sleeping dogs lie. Tell that to the Hendricks family. Tell that to Sarah, having to see him every day, remembering what she lost. Clara finished her shopping quickly and returned to the boarding house, the overheard conversation weighing on her mind. She found herself watching Jesse Colt with new eyes, looking for signs of the burden he carried. She saw it in the careful way he avoided the center of town, in the route he took to and from his work that kept him away from the school and the bank. She saw it in the way he held himself, like a man who had learned to carry weight that others could not see. That evening, as she was preparing dinner, Mrs. Patterson appeared in the kitchen doorway. You've been quiet today. Everything all right? Clara considered her words carefully. I heard some talk at the store about Mr. Colt. Mrs. Patterson's expression grew guarded. What kind of talk? About something that happened 2 years ago. About the Hendricks family. Mrs. Patterson was quiet for a long moment, then sighed. I suppose you were bound to hear it eventually. Small town, long memories. She moved to the stove, stirring the pot of stew Clara had been preparing. Jesse was engaged to Sarah Hendricks. They had been planning to marry, had the church reserved and everything. But Jesse had debts, his family's old debts that had followed him even after he left. He got involved with some men who promised to help him pay them off, but the work they offered was not the kind that bears close examination. Clara felt her heart sink. What kind of work? The kind that happens in the dark, away from town, moving things that did not belong to the people moving them. Mrs. Patterson's voice was heavy with old sadness. Jesse was young and desperate and in love, and he made choices that seemed right at the time but turned out to be wrong. She paused, her hands stilling on the wooden spoon. The law caught up with them eventually. There was a fight, shots fired. One of the men Jesse was working with was killed. A young man, barely 20, with a wife and a baby on the way. Clara closed her eyes, understanding beginning to dawn. And Jesse. Jesse was cleared of any wrongdoing. The judge said he was defending himself, that he had no choice. But the young man's family did not see it that way. Neither did a lot of folks in town. And Sarah, Mrs. Patterson's voice trailed off. Sarah could not marry a man with blood on his hands, Clara finished quietly. That's about the size of it. Jesse left town the day after the trial ended, said he would not put Sarah through any more pain, would not make her choose between him and her family's reputation. Clara absorbed this information, feeling her understanding of Jesse Colt shift and deepen. He was not just a drifter looking for work. He was a man trying to make amends for choices that had cost lives and destroyed futures. He was a man who had given up love to protect the woman he loved from the consequences of his actions. And now he's back, she said. Now he's back, Mrs. Patterson agreed, though I cannot say why or for how long. That night Clara lay in her narrow bed under the eaves, listening to the sounds of the boarding house settling into sleep. She thought about Jesse Colt, about the weight he carried and the choices that had shaped his life. She thought about Sarah Hendricks, about the love that had been lost and the pain that lingered. She thought about the strange way life had of bringing people together and tearing them apart, of offering second chances and closing doors. Most of all, she thought about the conversation they had shared on the porch, about the understanding that had passed between them. She had told him about her own losses, her own sense of displacement, and he had listened without judgment. Now she understood why. He knew what it was to have your life changed by circumstances beyond your control, to find yourself starting over with nothing but determination and the hope that somehow, someday, things might be different. Clara drifted off to sleep thinking about rivers and currents, about the choices that carried people downstream from where they started, and about the courage it took to keep swimming when you did not know where the current would take you.